All right, so Shirley Wu is an award-winning data visualization designer who's based currently out of New York. Shirley was has been part of DVS since early on, has been a wonderful supporter. We're thrilled to have her here joining us today, talking about some of her journey around data visualization in the world of data viz. And I think as we think about how we use these conferences and spaces to bring people together, having conversations about kind of who we are and the journeys we go on is really important, and about how our field has evolved. Because it focuses on more than just the tech components. Those are the things that maybe AI can take away from us. Maybe, I don't know. But the community part and how we learn and grow as people, it can't. I mean, those are some of the most important skills that we can have.
Thank you so much. Hello, good morning. Thank you so much thank you for that beautiful intro talk and the intro. Thank you for having me here today, and thank you for being here. I am so excited to be here at this first in-person Outlier. But before we get started, I want to give a disclaimer. This talk, like Amanda mentioned, is a very personal one. It doesn't have any explicit takeaways or lessons. And it's a talk that I feel comfortable giving only at a few conferences in the world. And I gave the first half of this talk at I/O last year, but this second half is brand new and dedicated to you, the data visualization community that has given me so much. So I hope you like it. When I was a child, I was loud and stubborn and willful and always wanted things my way. Except that was the very opposite of what a good Chinese girl is supposed to be. Quiet and demure and humble with Xinyar, who always knew her place. And as a Chinese kid growing up in the Japanese countryside in the 90s, honestly, kind of really brutal, if you know, you know. All I wanted was to fit in with my Japanese classmates and maybe make my parents proud. So I tried really hard to be quiet and humble and know my place. But then we moved to America when I was 10 years old. And suddenly it was okay for me to be loud and opinionated, and I felt so free to be myself. Until, that is, I got to high school and college, and I started being told that I was intimidating. That I was intimidating in the way that I asked questions and speech and debate. That I was intimidating when I was delivering my opinions in club meetings, even though in all of those instances, I was just being myself. And without even realizing it, I started to make myself small. By the time I started as a software engineer in Silicon Valley, I would second-guess myself every single time I wanted to speak up in a meeting. And afterwards, I would wonder to myself if I had said too much, if my explanations had been too convoluted and meandering, if I had spoken too aggressively. I had become afraid to take up space, and I would try so hard to be as non-threatening as possible. And I started to refer to my work as silly and make light of my accomplishments, that anyone who had put in the obscene number of hours that I had could do the exact same thing. I had made a small, socially acceptable box for myself, put myself squarely in it, and convinced myself that that was the place I belonged. Hello, I'm Shirley. I'm gonna pause real quick right here to introduce myself before we get too far into the story. I'm a software engineer, data visualization designer, storyteller, and I work with my clients on the full data analysis, design, and code process so that we can turn their raw data into beautiful, awesome, compelling visual narratives for the web. I also co-author data sketches with my dear friend Nadi Varma, a book where we detail the process behind 24 of our data visualization projects. And pre-pandemic, I used to give talks about the technical challenges I overcame, the lessons I learned while working on my projects. But today I want to tell you a little bit about myself, about where I've come from, how I've grown, and where I hope to go from here. So let's get back into it. In 2016, I was 4 years into a full-time software engineering career, and I loved the data visualization product I was working on, but I wasn't like the biggest fan of the industry I was in, which was enterprise security. Nothing wrong with it, just not the most exciting to me. So I decided to quit and try my hand at freelancing, specifically in data visualization, so that I could see what kind of projects and data sets and challenges were out there. It was a simultaneously really exciting, but also really stressful decision. But I was determined to make it work. That same summer, I got really obsessed with this musical called Hamilton, where I was listening to the cast recording on repeat so often, I started analyzing the lyrics for repeating phrases and themes, and then making this visualization, my very first attempt at a scrolly, where each dot represents a set of lyrics sung by a character, and these burst apart and come back together as you scroll through the web page. And the following year, I got to work on this piece with The Guardian, US team, and Nadi, where we told the story of the American cities that bought bus and even airplane tickets for their homeless people to relocate them elsewhere. These two pieces have so much more reach and impact than I could have ever imagined, and they helped me see my work in a brand new light. That what I used to call this silly little data viz thing I do could actually inspire people and incite conversations. And that gave me the validation I needed to keep freelancing and doing what I loved. And over time, I came to realize that what I loved was the freedom that came with freelancing, that I got to choose the projects that really aligned with my interests. And that helped me discover and learn more and more about myself. In 2018, I created my very first 3D data visualization because I have been fascinated with this idea of creating a physical installation for quite a few years. And I was really obsessed with this idea of being able to be fully immersed in a work, to be able to hold a person's full attention as they walk through and experience it with their whole bodies instead of just their thumbs. But for the longest time, I had a hard time imagining what that would look like for me. And all I could think of was projecting my work onto a wall, which kind of really defeats the point of having a third dimension. Until I realized that, of course, that's all I could think of. I worked in 2D virtually on a laptop all day long. So perhaps if I wanted to start working and thinking in that third dimension, I could start by working virtually on my laptop in 3D. So I taught myself 3JS and a little bit of WebGL and created Legends, a 3D data visualization of the 51 women Nobel laureates between 1901 and 2018, each represented as crystals, sized by their influence and colored by the category of their award, where you could, quote unquote, walk through and read about each of their accomplishments, or fly up and see them organized by the decade of their award. And then we can see that, especially in that first half of the century, there are barely any women Nobel laureates, and that it's only in the last 2 decades that the numbers have increased to double digits. And each of those stars that you see floating around them, each of those stars represent one of the more than 800 men that have won the award in that same amount of time. This project taught me so much about myself. First of all, I was really taken aback and kind of honestly incensed by that huge discrepancy between the number of female and male Nobel laureates. And that made me realize that, sorry, there's something else on the screen right there that I don't know if that's cheering me on. I don't know, but it's not the same as, okay. All right. And that made me realize that I have barely ever seen women's names in the history and science textbooks that I had studied out of in high school. And that in turn made me realize how deeply that lack of representation had impacted me, that had somehow subconsciously imprinted into my brain that women could not be legacy worthy. And for the first time, I saw how small I had made myself, how I stopped myself from dreaming anything bigger than this box I had made for myself. And all at once, I remembered my very first dream, to be an artist. I had given up on that dream almost as soon as it had taken root, because even at 4 years old, I could feel the financial difficulty of that dream for my immigrant family. But at 29, I was much more financially stable, I had a little bit more skill sets, and much more confidence. And I became determined to be an artist. Except coming from tech, didn't know the first thing about what it meant to be an artist. So I applied to a series of artist residencies, all of which I got rejected from, because let's be real, I had no idea what I was doing. Until I was invited to be in residence at New York University's Tisch ITP, a master's program in art and technology, where I got to audit Introduction to Physical Computing and learn about Arduinos and sensors and LEDs and motors, and Intro to Fabrication, where I got to learn how to actually work in 3D. And I created this truly, actually silly drawing robot with 2 servo motors and 2 calligraphy pens. Look at that, it's so adorable, it falls and then it gets back up. That's my life goals. And recreated 5 of my favorite Legends crystals with laser cut acrylic and LEDs. But what was the most exciting about being at ITP was all the inspiring people I got to meet. And I ended up working with 2 of the students, Tina and Christina, to create a follow-up to my Legends crystals. One amongst many is a physical data installation of 16 women in computing, each represented as a glowing orb hanging from the ceiling, arranged in the space by the decade of their accomplishment. And even though each of these women, they're all so cool, and their contributions to computing so badass, we had never heard of most of them before this project. And so we decided to start each of the orbs dimly lit, and as a person walked up to an orb and read about the women described inside, that orb would glow a little bit brighter and brighter until the whole field was brightly lit. This project was installed at ITP's 2019 winter show, where hundreds of people came through, with this website as the digital counterpart so that anyone around the world could read about each of these women. And please read about them because they're so cool. I didn't get to be at the show, but Tina and Christina made sure to send me plenty of photos after and tell me all the stories of people's reactions. And my favorite story is that of an older woman at the university's computer science department who said that the installation made her hopeful that one day people would honor her work in this way. This project was so far outside of my comfort zone technically, but at the same time, I felt so supported by the ITP community to make it into a reality and had so much fun working with Tina and Christina that I felt emboldened and victorious, like I was bursting out of that box by literally taking up space. And that same week, on my 30th birthday, I finally dared to dream a new dream. Not an achievable goal like all the ones I've set for myself before, but a dream that felt so far out of reach. I want to make art that hundreds of thousands of people will come see. And I want to make them with the funnest, most talented team of my own. But if I'm gonna be honest with myself and with you, for the longest time, I could barely whisper that dream out loud to myself because it just sounded so ridiculous. And every time those doubts started creeping in, I would remind myself of all those photos and stories from the show, and I would hang on to that dream even tighter. And I would tell myself over and over again that even if everyone else thought that this dream of mine was ridiculous and out of reach, that I should not be the one getting in my own way. And I entered 2020 bright-eyed and so full of hope for all of the new physical work that I was going to make. And well, you're laughing because we all know what happened next. I'm so grateful that all of our friends and family were safe and that we maintained the roof over our heads, but at the same time, I lost all the potential clients I had been talking to because of budget freezes, clients that never came back, and I went 7 months without income. At first, I had no idea what to do with all of that sudden, unplanned free time. So I threw myself headfirst into this project, People of the Pandemic, a hyper-local cooperative simulation game, which became a way for me to wrap my mind around what was happening outside with the pandemic, which in retrospect was a very unhealthy coping mechanism for what was happening in those first 2 months where I kind of just worked myself around the clock in denial. And by the end, I was so burnt out that I could barely look at my own computer, and I spent the next month playing Animal Crossing and making really cute resin earrings, which, nothing wrong with this. I have no regrets, just only the burnout part, And I repeat this process of working myself to the extreme and burning out 2 more times in 2020. The last time, while working on the final design layout for our data sketches book. And by the time Nadi and I handed in our final design files in December 2020, I had stared at my own work for a month straight, something that I don't recommend, and was in a burnout so deep that I could not bring myself to look at my own past work for months and months after. And perhaps most alarmingly, I felt so strongly that I never wanted to make a data visualization ever again, which, considering that was kind of how I made my living, was really kind of concerning. And I spent those following months introspecting and talking to friends, and I learned 2 really important things about myself. First, that I really still love telling stories with data. I just was really exhausted from creating data visualizations for the web with all those browsers and screen sizes and edge cases, and I feel just so tired just thinking about it. And second, I've always loved learning new things. That's how I became so in love with code and data visualization in the first place. But finishing that book helped me realize that I had reached the peak of what I wanted to learn in creating data visualizations, at least for the web. And I was deeply, deeply craving a change. And so I decided to listen to those gut feelings. And in the fall of 2021, I started as a graduate student at NYU ITP, that same program where I had created one amongst many 2 years prior. And I entered my first year with absolutely 0 plans and just let myself take whatever physical computing and fabrication class I wanted. And I ended that first year embracing the state of uncertainty that I was in. That I was in this place of great transition from one city to another, from one phase of my career into the next. And in fact, my whole life has been a series of transitions that have never fully settled, caught in between countries and cultures and places of belonging. And that is a lot to unpack. But fortunately, I have spent the past decade creating data visualizations to understand the outside world. And now I had the time and space to look inward and create art to understand myself. I got to share all of that at I/O last year. It was my first in-person conference since the pandemic, and it was so beautiful to be able to be in community again. And I shared this story and received so much kindness and understanding in return. If you were there, I see some of you in this audience, if you were there, thank you so much. You gave me the courage to keep sharing this story. After I/O, I had the opportunity to put on a one-night pop-up art show. My first ever solo show, which is still kind of feels crazy to say out loud. This is Wonder and Hope, where each dot represents a photo I've taken between 2018 and 2022. The flowers represent flower photos, the double circles are food photos because they kind of look like plates. And all of the small dots represent all the other photos. And they're positioned according to where I took the photo, so the further away from the center means the further away I was from home. And if they are within that solid circle in the center, it means I took the photo while I was at home. I had a lot of fun thinking about how I would translate those web elements that I got so used to working with into the physical, and I ended up creating all of these different physical layers. Where at the base is those dots and flowers of the visualization that I printed in color on paper. I think of that as the HTML5 canvas layer. And the annotations I laser etched onto acrylic, and because acrylic has this like a little bit of thickness, it casts, I think, this really beautiful IRL drop shadow. And that is the SVG layer. And the stories and instructions of how to read the visualizations, those are on 2 other layers of acrylic. And they are the divs that scroll past on the webpage. And so as you walk through this first half of the room, you are literally scrolling through my story about all of the wonder that I used to feel being outside before the pandemic. And this first half also doubles as the onboarding for the main visualization, where as you turn around that corner, you encounter March 2020, where the dots have shrunken into that solid inner circle, and beneath it is the main visualization that animates within that water bowl. And water drips from above, disturbing the visualization, each water drop representing a number of COVID deaths in that same time frame. And the way that the water disturbs the image, that is the best visual that I could think of to represent how distorted reality felt like in that time during the pandemic. And then you turn the corner again, and you counter this triptych that represents those first 3 months of the pandemic where I only ever left home for groceries. And then the remaining half of the story, kind of denouement, where I talk about the effects that all of those reports of anti-Asian hate crimes had on me, of how I became overcome with panic every time I had to walk outside by myself, of how I would keep my eyes down because I was afraid that if I looked up and accidentally made eye contact, that would be the trigger for a hate crime. And of how in March 2022, I finally realized how much I had lost the wonder I used to feel about being outside and was instead filled with a fear and anxiety. And after that, I forced myself to look up and around whenever possible. Until one day in April, when I look up and see the first flowers blooming. And for the first time in a long time, I feel the joy overtake the fear. And in that moment, I feel hope again. And as you read and finish that last bit of the story, you look up and you see the flowers that have been there all along above your heads, gently lighting up as people pass underneath. This show was such a big one. It was the first time I had purposefully used data, to try and understand myself, to work through my own experiences. And it was also the first time I gathered up the courage to reach out and ask for help on such a personal project. And I am so grateful to all of my friends that answered my panicked calls for help, that spent 10-hour days fabricating and installing with me. And to those of you who were able to show up in person to support or who wished me luck from afar, thank you. From you, I learned. And I think a lot of people here might be able to relate to this, that when we create something digital and put it out on the internet, that we never truly get to have a sense of the number of people we've reached. Now, we might, in retrospect, know by the page numbers. Or maybe some people are really, really nice and reach out to us afterwards to tell us their thoughts. But with this show, I got to see each person that showed up, and I got to see their reactions in real time. And I knew that this was what I was working towards when I set out to make these physical installations, but I could have never imagined how magical or emotional it felt to be able to see their faces as they read my story, as they teared up with me and smiled with me and gave me hugs at the end. And this happened so many times over the course of the night. And that kind of in-person reactions, those moments of connection and community, they were so beautiful and so healing. And I also realized that I was only able to put out this, to me, very vulnerable story into the public because I got to put it in such an intimate and safe physical space where everyone had to show up in person authentically as themselves. And that taught me that at least for the time being, I am so interested in creating physical data art that is vulnerable, that heals and nourishes. And I took that with me as I started my thesis and my final year at ITP. And I decided that I wanted to take this opportunity to really work through some deep things, like deep emotional things, so that hopefully by the time I graduated, I could have a fresh new start. And I knew that I wanted to tell these stories in that same physical format where it felt so much more real and intimate and powerful. And as I began to kind of go through that process of introspecting and digging, I found rage. Deeply rooted, quiet, and simmering rage. And I was able to identify two sides to this rage. The first one from my childhood and the quiet trauma that I inherited from my parents, who had, by the time I was 10 years old, made 4 life-changing moves. From China to the Philippines, Philippines back to China, from China to Japan, and Japan to America. And the second, from my adulthood and my time as a woman in tech. I wrote this in my thesis paper, that the Silicon Valley sexism I encountered was the most spectacular forms of gaslighting and undermining. By the end of my 4 years working full-time, I had such a disproportionately low opinion of my work. I had once read that being a woman or person of color in tech is like a death by 1,000 paper cuts. Countless microaggressions, each too negligible to report, but excruciating as they added up. It resonated so perfectly that it hurt. It took me years to realize how small I had made myself, how much it had affected my interactions with clients as I began working for myself, how much I was undercharging for the value that I was bringing. It took me even more years to regain the confidence to acknowledge that I'm spectacularly good at what I do. And for that, I have the data visualization and wider web community to thank. Free from the politics of a small but successful startup, they celebrated every project I've ever put out. They told me over and over that I am incredible at what I do. 6 years after I left full-time, I finally wholeheartedly believe them. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe myself. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. A week after I wrote those very words, this project was awarded Most Beautiful out of 1,300 entries at the Information is Beautiful Awards. And in that moment, not this moment, because I was like really flustered and panicked about what to say, because I didn't expect it at all, not this moment, but on the train ride home, I felt this deep sense of calm, and I no longer felt that desperate need to prove myself and my technical capabilities that I used to feel as a remnant of my time in tech, and I finally felt fully at peace with myself and the work I make. And I came home and performed this piece. A story with almost no words, where the colors that I paint are turned into sound. And each drop of Chinese calligraphy ink represents a case of anti-Asian hate crime reported in New York City. And by March 2021, the amount of black ink becomes overwhelming. And I am forced to reconcile with it. And then this piece, titled, Though a Patriarchy May Privilege the Changeless, sorry, it's a very long title. I always get this mixed up. It's from a book. Though a patriarchy would privilege the changelessness of the sun over the inconstancy of the moon and you. Where red ink drips according to my 2020 menstrual data, inspired by the shame that I used to feel in my teenage years that my period never came on the same days of the month, and that somehow my body was abnormal because of that irregularity. Until I started using a period tracking app, and I realized that my cycle is very regular. And what was highly irregular was actually the solar calendar that shifts between 31 days to 30 to 28 to sometimes even 29 days in a month. And I realized the problem was not me. And I finished these two pieces excited about the possibilities of data art that challenges and defies. And then I continued working on my thesis, where I proposed 2 physical installations for the 2 sides of my rage. And ultimately, because of time constraints, I decided to focus on just the first installation, the one centered around my childhood. And as a starting point, I was deeply inspired by this passage from Stephanie Fu's life-altering memoir, What My Bones Know, where she writes, I realized that my community in San Jose was built in large part from the wreckage of America's brutal proxy war against communism. San Jose is America's consolation prize for those who lost Saigon and Seoul. I also spoke to dozens of Asian children of immigrants, Asians of my generation. everyone always wanted me to know that their parents were good people. They came here with nothing. They overcame so much. They're just, stoic, anxious, quiet. And I became fascinated with this dichotomy of being an immigrant arriving in a new country filled with so much hope and expectation, and to find instead a reality so vastly different. So this is my thesis project called Untitled, We Still Land Home, where Chinese calligraphy ink drips from above onto roiling, billowing fabric. And each drop represents a number of Chinese immigrants that have moved to America. And the fabric I think of as the American land, and the fans underneath as the American sentiments against Chinese immigration that are literally making the fabric into difficult terrain for the ink to land on. And over the course of a few hours, the ink moves from slowly, methodically, from the far side of the fabric to the front, dispensing ink according to immigration data from 1850 to the present. And in working on this project, I've come to realize that I've been asking this project the questions that I could never bring myself to ask my parents. What was it like to leave home and start over and over again, far from your support networks? Did you have to feel discrimination and fight to survive? Did you feel a powerlessness, a voicelessness in every new country with every new language? Did you expect to pass that down onto me? And the piece answers me with every drop of ink that lands not where intended, but instead scatters messily in every direction freely. And I think of all the lives that each drop of ink represents, all the lives lived, struggled, settled. 1,000 different imaginings for 1,000,000 different lives. And I am reminded that even if we don't land where we intended, we still land and we make homes for ourselves. And there is incredible resilience and so much beauty. I finished this piece 2 weeks ago. Actually 2 weeks ago. It's really fresh. And I'm so happy I get to share it with you, and also all of the things that I've come to understand about myself through this process. That I've come to really love working with motors because I literally get to move the world around me with them. That I really enjoy working with water and ink and air and wind because they feel like the soothing balms to my rage. Even though just 6 months ago, I have felt that deep sense of calm that I didn't need to prove myself, I felt myself slipping back into that bad habit of mine halfway through this project where I just wanted to keep adding more and more and more because everything felt like they were not enough. And there was a beautiful moment in which I realized that if I could just keep my visual forms simple and minimal and elegant, that would be the biggest defiance that I could have against all of those incessant pressures that I used to feel as a woman in tech, being told constantly to prove myself. And I love with an almost vengeance, that I am using every last drop of skill that I've gained in tech to create these works, to regain my power. I'm about to graduate in 2 weeks. And I still have no idea what the future looks like. I have no idea how I'm going to get from that A to the B to the C of that big, big, big dream of mine. But for now, I want to keep exploring and creating these pieces of physical data art that are vulnerable, that heals and nourishes, that challenges and defies, that joins a conversation. And I'm excited about all of the experimentation and exploration and where that might take me, about these data-driven pieces that aren't necessarily about conveying an exact number, but are instead all about communicating a feeling. And as for that box, some days I am still filled with so much rage. And some days I just want to be like, F the box, F the social norms. I'm going to be exactly myself, and if that's intimidating, then deal with it. And then other days I'm like, I just want to retreat into the familiarity of and the kind of safety of this box. But more and more, I want to open up that box so that I can set my own boundaries for myself. So that instead of letting this box and what is socially acceptable define me, I am determined to define who I am myself. So hello again. I'm Shirley. I am a Chinese American woman, proud daughter of immigrants, software engineer, data visualization designer, storyteller, solopreneur, creative director, artist. And I am here to take up so much space. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that very vulnerable way to open the talk. And I know, for me, I sat there thinking, there's no better case I've seen for the importance of physical visualizations and thinking outside of flat kind of things we scroll through in digital spaces.
I thought you were going to say outside of the box.
No, I'm not going to take your box. I'm not going to steal your box metaphor.
Okay.
But I think that it's a beautiful reflection on the ways in which, taking that approach to taking a more creative arc is interesting. I'm curious, though, as we look to the audience also for their questions, I look at that and think, how would I ever make something like that? So if you were thinking to give advice to your younger self before you were working in a cool lab, what kind of physical stuff would you start with if someone wanted to start playing with more of these physical interpretations and expressions of data?
Oh my gosh, okay, so I've gotten a lot of how do you get started in visualization? This is the first time I've ever gotten how do you get started in physical data visualization.
Excellent.
So this is me stalling for time.
Okay, good. And I'm going to open up the floor also. If anyone is thinking about interesting questions, we have plenty of time for questions for Shirley. I think there might be a mic floating. Yes?
But that is a really great question. And I feel like, I guess it depends. Just like how with visualization, I think it really depends on the background in which we come from. Mm-hmm. And so for me, because I came from a tech background, it made a lot of sense to approach it from that tech lens of, it just made me really happy to learn Arduino, which is a microcontroller, a tiny little thing where you can upload tiny little programs onto. And that made me really happy. But I'm also deeply inspired by Amy Sessel and all of her Play-Doh work. How long ago is that?
2017?
Holy shit, yeah.
She spoke about it in a class we co-taught, so I should know this actually better.
I'm really inspired by that. I'm also really inspired by domestic data streamers who are in Barcelona, and they do these physical work where they go out in public and they ask people and they push strings. I think if you have ever seen those string parallelograms, I think those are theirs, and they have a piece where they have people put tree trunk or split tree trunks onto this plot that they have, and so I think
even though my approach was through tech, I think there's plenty of ways to explore physical visualizations that are really, they're all very amazing.
And that you can buy the materials at Target. You can buy those at Target.
Yes.
Like Play-Doh, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the question always, is like, how do you get String, Play-Doh.
Yeah.
Like we can buy these things, right? I think I have them in my like 4-year-old's craft box. We've got a mic floating around and I see hands. So why don't we go to the front here? If you just introduce yourself, your name, where you're joining us from, and your question for Shirley. Right up here. There we go. Just stand where you are. We'll bring over the mic.
Hi, thank you. I'm Leticia. I'm from originally Brazil, but I live now in Barcelona. And I've seen many of the work that has been put out in terms of physical data visualization as well, working with the domestic data streamers. But I wanted to hear your opinion, having been someone that worked, I'm from Odd Studio, I forget to say stuff, like, sorry. Having been someone that works so long in web and developing and working in that area that you see things move really fast when you start working with it, how do you see the difference in timing when you're working with a project, when it's more artistic and more like physical, compared to something that you were doing like digitally and instantly maybe you would see results? Like, what's the pace of things for you now?
Ooh, this is such a great question. And I feel like these are some of the things I would have loved to talk about, but does not fit into a talk. So the difference in pace between digital versus physical work, and you're absolutely right that like web like goes so quickly. And that was the first thing I had to get used to in the physical, which is like you have to get materials. And you have to test different materials, like that fabric for my thesis. I literally had to go like into Midtown Manhattan and go to a fabric store and go through all these different pieces of fabric and get scraps, ask them for like little scraps that I could test on. I tested 4 different ones and then spent like $100, like getting more other ones to test how the ink would drop. That's the first one, is like the process is all just a lot longer and it costs like literally time and money. It costs more. But I kind of really love the fact that it's so drawn out. I almost feel like in the digital, I can just refresh and code and refresh, and then I don't maybe get to the time to introspect on a project until afterwards. Whereas because I literally have to like, sometimes I just can't get things in a store and have to wait for it to ship for like a week. And I'm just like waiting there and I get to think a lot more. It's also really different in that like I get to be really precise with code, like pixel precise. Whereas here, like, you know, when I'm fabricating, I'll get it pixel perfect in Illustrator, and then I go to laser cut it, and of course, like, our laser cutters are kind of really abused, so then, like, they're off by, like, millimeters, and, like, things don't fit together, and you have to redo it, and things that seem simple take, like, hours. But yeah, still slower. TLDR is slower. Oh, but, sorry, one last thing about this. Whereas before with digital work, it's almost like I usually do like one and done. So I finish a project, I publish it, and it's done. But because with physical work, especially because like sometimes it like takes up so much room, it comes together. I see it for the first time, and maybe I present it for the first time. And then I get to get feedback on it, and I iterate on it. Because that first iteration is never perfect. And so I think, like, for example, that thesis piece I think of as like the first working prototype. And then hopefully I'll get funding, actual funding, instead of self-funding, and then be able to make it like even bigger and exactly how I imagine, try different fabrics. And yeah.
Yeah, funding is always a fun question.
I know.
Marilia, we have a question, I think, from our folks online.
Yes. So, hi. Sonia Kuipers.
Hello, Sonia.
She just said, "Hi, Shirley. Do you think that it was your own need to connect but didn't have the correct language that made you share your experiences, hoping that everyone in DataV sees this as an opportunity and valid reason for creation?"
Sorry, what to connect? What?
Do you think that it was your own need to connect but didn't have the correct language that made you share your experience?
that I had the only, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Do you think your own need
Your own need.
need to connect?
Oh, need to connect.
need to
Thank you.
connect.
Sorry,
Not
sorry,
the
sorry.
right
I'm so
language,
sorry. I have hearing problems.
It's also that we all like flew across the ocean. to get here. We'll just blame jet lag for things right now.
I'm not that
That's
sleepy
okay.
much, yeah. My own need to connect, to make visualizations. I've never thought about that. Yeah, I've never thought about that. I think it's just, I don't know if it's ever about, it never started as a need to connect. At first, it was just I had a job, and I had to make it. But I think, and maybe now I'm kind of like, I think that more and more, especially after the pandemic, especially all of that isolation, I think the physical work is really nice for me because I get to have conversations like one-on-one, not just for like from friends or family that I ask for feedback, but like from strangers that might come by and they encounter the work for the first time, and I get to have kind of, I'm sharing my story and I get to have their story in return. So that connection is really nice. It was never an intention. It's just a really nice benefit that I never expected.
Nice. Other questions in the room? Yes, in the back. We'll do our best to get a mic, but if you want to come towards the mic, that might be helpful.
Oh,
And Marilia, I will ask you to keep me honest on time since I can't see a clock.
I also have very long answers.
You're okay.
Hi, I'm Irene, and I wanted to ask you related to the difference between digital and physical. One is, how do you let go of controlling everything? Because because in digital it's pixel perfect, right? But the wind, the water, they create effects that you cannot control. And the other one is, with digital you can always go back, but with physical, it's an installation, it's temporal. Do you miss it? How is it?
Oh, what a great question. Nadia and I were actually talking about this yesterday, about physical versus digital, about perfection and control. And actually, before I ever started coding, I used to take a lot of art classes, and my medium was watercolor. So 14 years before college, I painted in watercolor. And there's something, I think, really beautiful about the fact that you can never do a perfect undo with watercolor, right? Like you might, do something and mess up, and then you'll try and blot it out with some water, and you might be able to get most of the color out, but you still leave a trace. And then you have to either I was a huge perfectionist when I was a child and a control freak, so either I have to throw it all out and be like, I'm done with this, or I have to accept it. And sometimes I'm like 3 days into a painting and my deadline for art class is tomorrow, and I can't just throw it out, and so I have to accept that imperfection. And I kind of really grew to love that. So in some ways, it took me a really long time to get used to drawing digitally, because it felt so weird to have that perfect undo that leaves absolutely zero trace. So it's actually kind of the opposite way for me, that I kind of love that imperfection. I love that mistakes leave a trace, because I think that it makes me feel very human. And so in some ways, I think that I kind of just went from physical to digital, and then kind of came back again. Even in physical, I've always wanted to kind of have that human trace and that imperfection and that messiness. And then, realized that I was literally trying to make a computer do exactly the opposite of what it was intending to do, which is kind of perfect calculation. So that's the control and the letting go of control. And then the second question, my answer was so long, I forgot my second question. Sorry. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Installations being temporary, that was really hard because never have I needed to actually put any time into documenting. I am so bad at photography. I am so bad at video and editing. I apologize for all of those videos I edited that you had to sit through.
They were lovely. They were very.
Thank you.
they
There
were
was
very
one that
helpful.
was
They were
very
good.
professionally done, and the rest were me. Because I'm pretty broke right now. It's been hard. Now I try to, after each show, kind of sit down the next day, write about my thoughts and what I've learned. I try really hard to get a videographer to come in if I've spent months of effort on it. I've been also really lucky to be able to make some friends through the program that are really good documentarians and ask for their help. But yeah, it's very different between something that lives online, not forever, but at least for 5 or 6 years, versus something that is so fleeting. And then also, how do you tell the full story of what exists physically and most people can't get to? And then how do you share that online? I don't think I can ever perfectly share what is physical online.
Question. Maria? Oh, sorry. Let's go here to the
Oh,
person.
no, I think.
Ooh, yep, perfect. There we go.
I'm from Nigeria and the UK. Oh, that is loud.
Hello.
Hi, my name's Obina. I'm from Nigeria and the UK. Thank you very much for your talk and for being so honest and vulnerable.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions, so I'll try to be quick. The first is, I also come from an immigrant background, doctor, lawyer, or failure. So I get what you were saying. So I'm kind of curious within that regard. This is coming from a bit of an amateur, I would say, in the space. How were you able to tell yourself that you were good enough to at least go all in the way you did? And then the second question is, from your talk, it sounded like you were very specific in how you created the physical space to tell a story as you went through the room. What was your thought process in telling that story?
Oh, okay. So first about, you mean stepping into freelance or stepping into, because my parents were not mad about software engineering. They were not. They were like, okay, fine. And at first I was doing investment banking and they were like, wait, you're switching to software? And they were confused about that. But they were very, very confused about the freelancing. They're like, you're gonna leave your tech job?
Security, right?
Security.
Yeah.
For the most unstable thing? Is that the? Yeah, I don't know if I ever was like, I'm gonna make it. I'm so confident in myself. My whole story is about how I was not confident at all in myself. It was really mostly that I think one of my core values of what drives me is novelty. I've been able to identify that I'm most excited about building new things, and I'm a really bad maintainer. I really, really respect maintainers, organizers. I'm really bad. Once I've built something, I want the next new thing. And so after I've done, a bigger company and a startup, and I was like, I just want to change. And it was more like I'm gonna try and make this work. And if it doesn't, I had to promise my parents that if I didn't make the same amount freelancing as I did in a full-time tech job, I had to go back to the tech job. So that was a really huge motivator. And again, I've taken so long that I've forgotten the second question. That's right. Walk through. Thank you. Walk through. How I think about walking through. And I think that was and that was kind of both being able to teaching myself 3JS and WebGL and thinking about how to lay things out in that virtual 3D space, I think helped me a lot. I've never gotten to VR, but I'm sure that VR really helps with this. And also just kind of I've ended up going to a lot of different installations of people and thinking about exhibition design. I find exhibition design very fascinating, of how they choose to tell the story of an artist, or even in a museum, how they choose to tell the story of that room. So I think all of those, I don't explicitly think about
like where all the influences come from.
It's an interesting question of exploring. Like, like, do you let someone wander however they want, or is there a sequence to it,
Yes,
right? And that, like, kind of, do you impose order on the space or not?
Yes, and I think that R.J. Andrews had a great chapter on it in the info we designed, and that was when I first started thinking about it, the way that galleries and exhibitions are designed, and and the way that where you place things as a way to force people through. Yeah, you're right.
Info We Trust.
Info
right?
We Trust.
Info We Trust. It's a
Yeah.
very good book. Two more, thank you. Two more questions, one online, and then we'll go to your last question in person. So, Aurelia, who do we have online?
So we do have a couple of questions, but maybe also one related to the last one, by Jessica Gergen. Has the physicality of your recent work created more of a physical space to discuss with your parents, family about their journey and some of your rage in being the daughter of immigrants?
Ooh, no. Great question. I think my parents would actually be very open to talking about it. I think in working through it, I've become more aware of these questions. I've not been able to ask them any explicit questions. There was a card game that I came across on Instagram, because Instagram knows everything about us, called like Parents Are Human Too or something, where designed by this Chinese American person that's like this playing card with a set of questions that are bilingual, so English on one side and like Chinese on another, or on any other language. And then it's this way to, and it asks from like the most basic of questions of like, what was your favorite food growing up, to like, what was the most challenging thing you've encountered in your life, or something. And so I tried to play with that with my parents. It was fascinating. They were very open. They were great about it. My parents are really great, but you know, just sometimes subconsciously, unconsciously.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, those like story prompts are helpful sometimes.
Yeah,
Just,
it
like,
was
things to
really,
talk about. It's
it
good.
was really nice. Yeah.
One more online, sure. We're just at time. Let's go ahead and let's take the last question in person that we promised, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. Go ahead.
Hello, you hear me?
Not quite. Mike.
I'll just speak.
Oh,
there we go. I'm Sebastian. I'm originally from Colombia, but now I'm doing my master's in data design in Barcelona. A lot of the professors are from domestic, so I'll let them know you give them a shout out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they'll be happy. My question is, as I'm doing my final exhibit, I'm interested in, I notice your work is a little bit of personal experiences and also research into things that seem to be interesting or interesting to you. What is that process when you're like in a jam and need ideas for a project? Like, do you look in personally or outside, or what do you do?
Well, it depends, which is always like so I think before this program, most of my work were about something external to me, so not about myself, and that was either because clients had the data set, or I was interested in something and I went out, and a lot of the data sketches projects are, we found a topic and we went out and got the, got the data sets. The more personal ones in terms of process, actually I started doing because of grad school and because we were given these very specific prompts that I had to answer, but I wanted to answer them with my own personal spin. So for example, that menstrual one, that one was in a class called Time, where there was a reading about how time as a construct, that like a clock or a watch, wait, sorry, I'm getting too deep into this tangent. Anyways, there was a prompt about time and I put my own spin on it, and I think it just kind of, the personal things just kind of layer into whatever research I am doing in that moment for the class. So I'm not sure how it's gonna go going forward. But I think I am starting to research more and more things that I'm personally interested in that are informed by my own life experiences. So it's not like a step-by-step, I read a book, then I wrote and journaled about myself, then I read another book. It just kind of, things kind of weave together, yeah.
Well, and process is a great place to end, I think, as we think about kind of how we move through the rest of our day. As we move on to our next speaker, huge round of applause for Shirley.
Thank you so much. Thank you.